the crime of genocide and of the prevention of this crime, while affirming the dignity of the victims of genocide, set commitment to upholding the responsibilities established in the Genocide Convention is essential to prevent genocide. Quoting him, ultimately, preventing genocide involves all of society. We all must join hands to defend the principles of equality and human dignity, and to repair the fissures and polarization that are all so prevalent in our societies today. Today, as we remember and honor the victims of the crime of genocide, let us not forget that the Genocide Convention, adopted in December 1948, was the first human rights treaty adopted by the UN General Assembly. It remains as relevant as ever as we work to prevent genocide and other atrocities, crimes that are sadly being perpetrated with impunity. Since 2016, the Armenian General Benevolent Union has proudly been standing with the United Nations to highlight the issues of genocide awareness, human rights, and refugee assistance. Throughout the years, our members across the globe have organized discussions, symposiums, and lectures, all with a shared purpose that focuses less on our own tragic history and more on what we are witnessing today. As the largest Armenian philanthropic organization in the world, AGBU continues its history of driving thoughtful conversations and impactful programming to support the global Armenian nation through cultural, educational, humanitarian, and socioeconomic development initiatives. Memory and Justice, Remembrance in the Aftermath of Political Violence today will focus on the politics of archives and their importance in providing justice in the aftermath of political violence. We'll focus on the role of memory as a form of prevention of further violence and war crimes, and as a way for enforcing accountability on the perpetrators. On behalf of the leadership of AGBU, I want to thank AUB's Issam Fares Institute, the Lepsius Haus, and all our collaborators, organizations, and speakers who believed in our cause. Our mission remains unchanged with the 6th edition of the December 9 conference. Along with our partners, we continue to be a leading voice in this global conversation. We continue to highlight past and current genocides happening in the world and help shape a world free of these preventable human tragedies. And we continue to promote a critical dialogue based on lessons learned through the history of our survival. We hope these forums will help us invest in prevention and commit to upholding these responsibilities established by the Genocide Convention, and will lead to much needed collaboration and action by the many stakeholders. On a different note, I would like to invite you to 2 other events. The first one is the display about Armenians in Lebanon, organized at the Jafet Library, and that's happening today. The exhibit portrays some aspects of the Armenian genocide featured in the Antura Orphanage album, and also a few postcards of the Armenian camps in Beirut. And the second event is the tribute event titled Savior in Armenian History, which happens to be a tribute to Johannes Lepsius, the German pastor, historical archivist, and campaigner for modern human rights. And that will be held on Monday, December 12 at 7:30 p.m. at AGBU Demirjian Center. And now, without further ado, I would like to invite the director of Issam Fares Institute, Dr. Joseph Bahoud. Dr. Bahoud, the floor is yours.
Good morning. So my name is Joseph Bahoud. I'm the director of the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs, and I'm very happy to welcome you all this afternoon. This is the 6th, I think, edition of conferences that IFI is holding regularly with the AGBU, the Armenian General Benevolent Union in the world. And this is the 6th conference that we are holding more or less around the same thematic of genocide, justice, memory, remembrance, reparation, and other very painful issues. Over time, my personal feeling, but I think that also AGBU's leaders are sharing the same feeling. I think that we are starting to build now a sort of intellectual and conceptual coherence around a very important theme, not only politically, but also intellectually and conceptually. How to think about past crimes, past wounds, past traumas, how to treat them, of course, politically and overcome them, but also how to treat them historically, methodologically, in terms of social science. And this is a very difficult and very complex endeavor that without which I think there can be no peaceful present and of course not a peaceful future above the wounds and above the collective traumas. Over time, also, and this is for me very important, the series of conferences have built a very solid and very friendly also partnership between IFI and AGBU. And I'm very thankful for that because both our institutions are here, at least partially, to think about the common goods and the common good and to think about how to better serve their respective communities. And by doing so, I think we are advancing this cause. This year, this is also an important event. The thematic is very important, but also what gives me pride and joy is that it is done also in conjunction with the Lepsius House. And I welcome you, Mr. Director. This is an honor and a very important thing for us to have you. So this is why also I'm looking forward for this partnership between us all to endure, to go on and to become even more fruitful in the future. And so I'm looking forward also, Mireille and Arine and others for future events in the year to come and in the years to come. Without further ado, I wish you good luck and interesting and enriching debates. And I'm sure that every year we are adding an additional stone in the wall of remembrance, reparation, and justice. Thank you, and see you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this warm welcome and happy to be here after so many online events. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome here on the site at the American University of Beirut, as well in the digital rooms all over the globe. I would like to start my intervention with a little thought experiment, which curiously wandered through my own mind in preparation for this conference. Bear with me. And let us imagine 64 years from now. Most of us will not be part of this world anymore. But this conference is recorded and will be somewhere stored on a server. One can argue that the topics and arguments of this conference will be archived and could be labeled as storage memory. According to historian Aleida Essman, storage memory functions as a knowledge that is sunk in the background and is currently not addressed. It is a kind of uninhibited memory. Thus, Essman considers historical sciences, which she characterizes as second-grade memory, the memory of memories, which incorporates whatever has lost its vital reference to the present. In order for stored memory to unfold from the subterranean stream of history, its elements have to be acquired, that is, chosen by importance, made accessible, and be given a certain meaning. Imagine that somebody is interested in the overall topic of memory and justice, remembrance in the aftermath of political violence, and starts a search on whatever devices they are using in the future, and would find, for example, this presentation I'm giving right now. In this case, this presentation is handled as an archival source. And that person watching this in the future could have different verdicts on this. Like, first, this guy's performance is very bad. He probably hasn't slept much. Or second, What he said is nothing new under the sun. And we in the future overcame all the mentioned problems of memory and justice. Both statements seem to be valid, but they touch base on different historical levels. The first statement refers to appearance of a person and, as a historical claim, rather touches on circumstances of a certain age. The person in the future could also express surprise that there was no quick, restful cryosleep in our time, which could have helped me with this performance. The second statement is an historiographical claim. On the one hand, this guy is saying something historically long established. On the other hand, due to the shared memory of past experiences of mass violence, a crucial step towards the long-term reconciliation between divided communities in the aftermath of political violence was possible to establish in the future. In any case, both statements are different perspectives on the same historical event found in an archive. In the past, historians often had clear moral compass to guide them, whether they believed in God, Enlightenment principles, or in Soviet Marxism. They were confident in a bright future and could therefore easily evaluate episodes in the past as being either positive step towards or negative deviations from the promised future. Theirs was an outright moral approach. As so-called modern historians, we are acutely aware how much we miss when we choose to live in these black and white moral universes. Today, it is a commonplace to say that history is a vast canvas of gray zones, which we must approach in the spirit of objectivity through a process of careful contextualization and willingness to enter the minds of people who committed terrible acts. Yet, the cost of this more scientific approach can be the appearance that our attempts to understand people on their own terms is next door to exonerating them of any moral culpability. In a book well worth reading titled History and Morality, historian Donald Bloxham argues that morality in historiography has in fact just gone below the surface. Under the veneer of objective, contextual approaches, historians continue to make moral judgments and moral decisions. Whether consciously or unconsciously, historians deceive themselves if they believe that morality plays no part in their work. Bloxham argues that historians must reckon with the acknowledged morality that continues to shape their work, often unconsciously. If one employs Bloxham's argument for the topics of our conference today, archives and memory, and connect that with what we learned from this thought experiment a few minutes ago, one can state archival sources are always be interpreted in different ways, which is what I call the crooked timber of memory, an analogy to the sixth proposition in Immanuel Kant's essay, Ideas for Universal History with the Cosmopolitan Aim, where he famously states about the moral compass of all humans that, I quote, from such crooked timber as humankind is made of, nothing entirely straight can be made, end of quote. This seems to be bad news, especially if one works, as some of you and I, in the history of the Armenian genocide, because genocide denialists always lurk around the corner. Furthermore, archives are neutral gatekeepers of memory. They do not grow naturally, but as the result of normatively structured social interaction, and in that sense, they are never neutral. Let me elaborate on these aspects for the remaining time, starting with the latter, and I always put it in the framework of the Armenian genocide because that's one I came from. Archives are dynamic technologies of rule which actually create the histories and social realities they ostensibly only describe, where some events are excluded and others are not. Just as with individual or collective memory, archivists or the institutional rules accompanying their work select and interpret the records, they are to become the archive. To consider archives as social institutions in which existing power structures are entrenched is mainly to say that they cannot be considered as neutral agents, but have to be acknowledged as major players in the business of identity politics. One crucial example for this claim is the gendered nature of the archival enterprise over time, showing that archives have been willingly agents in the creations of patriarchy by supporting those in power against the marginalized. Archivists primarily archive what they receive from dominant actors. We organized a conference with the AGBU Lebanon and the Issam Institute on genocide and viewed from a gender lens in December 2020. And especially in the early history of humanitarianism, where almost 2/3 of humanitarians were women, we can observe a gradual transition to tell the stories of these fine and brave individuals, if there is an adequate material in the archives, which is not always the case. Another aspect of the construction of archives, especially if you do research on genocide, are the perspectives on who is speaking what and how about. It is only since the beginning of the 1990s that historians came to consider testimonies produced by victims and survivors of the massacres and deportations as sources worthy of serious scholar interest, as historians Alexandra Gabarini and Boris Achemyan have shown. It's somehow, it's okay? Okay. Before that, official documents were the way to go. Victims seemed not to be reliable epistemic agents. The Armenian genocide is the second most researched genocide after the Holocaust, and there are so many archives established in the last decades. Not only the national archives of the mainly diplomatic and military bystanders and observers from France, Britain, Russia, the United States, as well as the Central Powers, Germany, and Austria and Hungary. Relevant sources are archived held by the Armenian Apostolic Church, the political spiritual leader of Armenians within the empire, archives containing repositories from the Dashnaks, as well as the First Republic of Armenia, located in Boston, the archives of the Armenian Patriarch in Jerusalem, and the Catholicos card in Echmiadzin, Armenia. Another important source is, of course, the AGBU Nouveau Library in Paris and the Zoyan Institute archives, where the families of Armenian survivors deposited their private documents from the 1980s on. One of the most significant but also controversial contributions to the discussions of the scope of recognition campaigns, denialism, and using archives in the Armenian context has been the work of philosopher Mark Nichanyan. Nichanyan, in fact, does not use the word genocide because of the effect a consistent campaign to prove the event as genocide has had on Armenian capacity to mourn the event. Nichanyan rather chooses the word afet, the words used by the Armenian author Zabel Zersayan to describe the 1909 pogroms of Armenians in Adana, and the subsequently used by writer Jakob Oshakyan in his word was a proper name for the murder of the Armenians. Nichanyan argues that the necessity to prove that the catastrophe falls within the parameters of the term genocide prevents and delays mourning of the event, since the necessity to fit the catastrophe within the codified law and insisting burden of proof. Nichanyan writes, I quote, "By using the word genocide, we survivors are only repeating again and again the denial of loss. We are doing what the executioner wanted us to do from the beginning on. We claim all over the world that we have been genocided. We relentlessly need to prove our own death. We are still in the claws of the executioner through and through," end of quote. To push for recognition and retribution within a juridical framework hinders mourning of the catastrophe when it becomes the only way in which to speak about the event. Genocide is not a fact, it is a destruction of fact. With this formulation, Nichanyan opens the phenomenology of the survivor, what he calls la perversion historiographique. Archives in this context just feed the twisted historiography, since all the facts are deniable and fall under the paradigm of the crooked timber of memory. These considerations became all more urgent when we turned to the aspects of denialism in genocide, or denialism and other forms of political violence. The most important reason for Turkey's inability to accept culpability for the Armenian genocide is, as historian Hans Lucas Kieser states, I quote, "The centrality of the Armenian massacres for the formation of the Turkish nation state, where any movement toward acknowledging culpability will put the very foundations of the Turkish nation state at risk and will lead to its steady demise," end of quote. We may have to add to this perspective that the persistence of recognition and institutionalization and professionalization of denial. On the eve of the Armenian genocide cemetery, the Turkish historiography propaganda machine proposed different conferences and workshops, even essay competitions in public schools, to show that there are archives and sources which tell another story of the Armenian genocide. Adopting the crooked timber principle, one could argue that these are just different perspectives, and that the proposal joint historical commission by Turkish President Erdogan, he proposed this kind of idea that there's a joint historical commission, would only conclude some other historical claims based on the same documents, like the thought experiments in the beginning. However, it can be assumed that there will be additional documents or that some sources would only be cited incompletely. That this strategy is quite old shows an example of the creation of an official Ottoman investigative committee with delegates from English, French, and Russian consulates at their site on January 26, 1895, after the massacres in Sassoon. Johannes Lepsius tells us about this finding of this commission in his book Armenia and Europe, and they had 108 proceedings, this committee, 108 proceedings, and it had the sole purpose of, I quote, investigating the criminal acts of Armenian brigands, only interviewing Turkish witnesses. I think the most compelling argument against this kind of denialism and revisionism is how archives, museum, libraries, and memorials create their knowledge on how they process from collection to the evidence is established. Truth and truthfulness are the key words here. Here, unfortunately, helps another thought experiment by philosopher Bernard Williams, which depends on his development of a state of nature story of fictional genealogy. It's a very simple argument. A, we can't get along without trust because humans flourishing creates a need for cooperation. B, but trust requires truthfulness, because if there's no chain of events of reliable behavior towards each other, every society has to fail. And C, truthfulness presupposes that there are at least some truth which one can rely on. As you may have noticed, I spoke on the politics of archives from a mainly historical and philosophical point of view. And I suppose that's the crooked timber of choosing a profession at one moment in life. And perhaps that cannot convince the obdurate denialists of genocide or other political violence. But it's my deepest credo as a human that for when there is no plain understanding of the past, an understanding which grew from a common, not always pleasant debate, there is no agreement on what it is that should be dealt with and how. The German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was very skeptic about the people and governments have ever learned anything from history or acted on principles used from them, as he wrote, I quote Hegel, "The pallid shades of memory struggle in vain with the life and freedom of the present," end of quote. Maybe it's time to transpose the politics of memories into a more brighter habitats of mind, and even if it sometimes hurts or is quite demanding. I'm looking forward to the next panels on these different perspectives on this topic, and thank you very much for your attention. So usually, I have to moderate the next panel. Okay. We had the deal, no Q&As after my talk, but you can ask me later on everything you want and criticize. So I will introduce the speaker of our first panel. So Maud Stefan. And the first panel is also a little bit on some general aspects on memory, also the archives and what the archives play a role in the memories of the political violence. And because we are a little bit in a hurry, I just say that Maud Stefan is a professor of information and library sciences, retired from Lebanese University. And she will talk about the uses and misuses of archives. Just for the proceedings, we have 3 talks. We have a tough program today, 3 talks, and then we have a Q&A session afterwards, 15 to 20 minutes. Okay, Maud, please, the floor is yours.
Okay. First, I would like to thank the AGBU for inviting me to this event. I thank in particular Arine Gazarian and Mireille Kanamirian, who gave me the opportunity to think and discuss about the archival profession and its social and political challenges. In fact, I'm joining you in the first part of your speak because how do I share? I share my screen. Yes. It's not
Sure.
Sure. Just this. And is it? No, I didn't share my screen. In fact, I have to share to share my screen. It's not like I do it.
Thank you for your attention.
So you count the 10 minutes after it is shared. Okay.
We'll manage.
Why?
It will make exactly the Zoom participants are going to still show.
The update one. Okay, is it working now? Okay. Since the last quarter of the 20th century, the archival profession is a subject of debates about the limits and challenges of its missions, which are expressed in dichotomies such as use and misuse, which is the title of my presentation, preserve and destroy, open or restricted access, the need to remember and the right to forget, archives as evidence and archives as memory. These terms are central to the scientific literature on archives, and each individual archivist has to face them in his or her daily work. The main task of the archival work are to appraise, organize and classify, describe, preserve, communicate, and valorize. The archivist, either working in a government institution or a private one, collects the records according to the institutional regulations. These documents are only fragments of what a society produces, and generally are what the powerful part of this society produces. Since their creation, the records reflect the balance of power in a society, and the archival institution dedicated to collect and preserve them is often a tool in the hands of this power. After collecting documents, the first action an activist undertakes is to evaluate them in order to select what should be kept and what should be disposed of. What a challenge for the archivist, and what a difficult contradiction. For selection implies destroying a part of the records, often the most voluminous part, whereas the mission of the archivist is to preserve the documents. This is what made Jacques Derrida say, the archive begins with the selection, and this selection is a violence. There is no archive without violence. It is a necessary violence because, also as Derrida said, where we would keep everything, there would be no archive. So how to appraise, what to select, and on the basis of what criteria? Records used for accountability are selected for their value as evidence, but whose accountability it is supposed to demonstrate or to ensure? Are the documents provided by rulers valid and sufficient as evidence to hold them accountable for their actions? To ensure justice, it is necessary to multiply the provenance of the archives. But this requires collaboration between several parties, because it cannot be the responsibility of an individual archivist in one individual institution. Archivists consider their work to be neutral, and they base their selection on the criteria of reliability and authenticity. For a document to be reliable, its content should be considered a complete and accurate representation of the facts it attests to. The decision, therefore, depends on the archivist's objectivity, honesty, and intellectual rigor. In situations of conflict, regardless of the rules and procedures followed, wouldn't there be an element of subjectivity in this type of decision? Trying to be as neutral as possible, archivists respect the original order and provenance and reduce their intervention to a minimum, keeping the records in their original collection and order, and carefully document their provenance. Their main mission is then to preserve the archives from any misuse which could harm the integrity of the collection, such as misplacement and loss of a document, physical deterioration, theft, as well as involuntary or even voluntary destruction. History has seen countless cases where archives has been deliberately destroyed to erase evidence of crimes, abuses, corruption, etc. Among the best known example is the destruction of its own archives by the apartheid regime in South Africa. The example that seems to me the most paradoxical is the destruction by the Hungarian regime in 2020 of all the archives of the Ministry of Interior of the previous communist regime, arguing, quote unquote, a democratic state cannot preserve immoral documents from an immoral regime. So they erase everything which could be used for justice. Directly related to our region is the destruction of all the documents attesting to the responsibility of the Israeli army and their political leaders for the perpetrated massacres against Palestinian villages. Closer still, the disappearance of the files of the Lebanese Ministry of Finance, covering public expenditure from 1993 to 1995, and those of 1996, being hidden in a walled room of the said ministry. But archivists also collect traces of the past for historical research, contributing in a context of violence to the quest for justice. By selecting what is worth remembering, they contribute to shape the memory. It is, for example, a challenge for those who collect oral memory and who influence this memory by their very questioning. For the purpose of historical research, the evaluation takes into account not only the criteria of authenticity and reliability, but also the historical value of the documents. In other words, we must choose what to remember from the perspective of the future historian who is attempting to understand today. But how to guess about the future value of a document that would more normally be discarded? For example, delivery notes are usually discarded when they are no longer needed for a transaction. But, for instance, documents attesting to the delivery of large quantities of Zyklon B gas to Auschwitz were considered after the World War II as evidence of homicidal use. So how to anticipate future uses? To better serve historians, archivists develop finding aids, such as indexes, to navigate through their holdings. They may bring together common or related themes and neglect others. By doing so, they create meaning and may impact future interpretations, shedding light on some part of the past and neglecting other parts, thus feeding the polemics in a conflict situation. Many archivists, aware that archival records do not necessarily reflect the full reality, call for a diversification of sources of documents, collecting multiple points of view, giving voices to the different components of the society, the marginalized ones, women, minorities, etc. They can contribute to the writing of a history not reduced to that of the powerful and the elite, enriching social memory, thus contributing to social cohesion. While the individual archivist can apply this principle within the limits of the prerogative assigned to him or her by his or her institution, the responsibility also falls on the profession as a whole to discuss these critical issues, to raise awareness of the challenges, to encourage the creation of diverse archival holdings, and to initiate cooperation in order to make available the records that represent the lives of all parts of society. Now, what is the situation of the Lebanese archives in a society fragmented by years of violence? The National Archival Institution, مؤسسة المحفوظات الوطنية, is under the authority of the Prime Minister and is responsible to preserve all the permanent archives of the state. The law defined its mission as broad as preserving all the Lebanese heritage, produced by public and private institutions and by individuals. They say preserving the intellectual, scientific, artistic, literary, political, and administrative heritage, everything. But in fact, the National Archives have never been provided with the human, physical, and financial resources necessary for the proper management of the documents and for their adequate preservation and organization. They were never able to collect the archives of all the ministries, institutions, and ministries. Instead, relying on the initiative of the different institutions to deposit their records. The archives received are simply stored and as received in poor conditions. Misuse is not restricted to the voluntary destruction of archives. Misuse and destruction can also be the result of negligence and poor governance. These permanent archives of the Lebanese state run the risk of being destroyed simply because of poor storage conditions, and they run the risk of being lost simply because of poor organization. I had finished, it's my last one. In the absence of a serious concern of the state for the preservation of the country's memory, many civil society initiatives have succeeded in creating archives. A master study in 2017 identified 25 archival institutions in Lebanon. Among these archival initiatives, some have done important professional work in preserving memory, each in a specific domain, such as photography, Image Foundation, traces of the civil war, modern architecture, music, newspaper, etc. Some are open to the public, but unfortunately, some others are not easily accessible. Such a multiplicity of initiatives is a richness for the memory of our society. To avoid the fragmentation of this memory, cooperation should be established to facilitate access to the various collections and to ensure their complementarity and compatibility. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, Maud, thank you very much for this very, yeah, please take a seat, for this very interesting talk. And I think a lot of questions later on. Okay, we going to the next talk. Can we see and hear them, or how does it work? I think we have to stop. Do we have to stop? Okay. No. Can just do it this way. What is it? Okay, now it works. Okay, perfect. So Paulo Irani is our next speaker. Please appear. Paulo, can you hear us?
Yes, I'm trying to activate my video, but it says I'm unable to. You have to do it on your end.
Okay. Then your voice is nice as well. We now shift a little bit to the investigative perspective. So Paulo Irani was working as an investigator in the office of the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court. And his title or talk is titled Promoting Accountability, Memory and Justice and Investigative Perspectives. So Paulo, you have 10 minutes. I know it's not a lot, but we have to keep in time a little bit, and we have time for Q&A later on. Okay?
Not a problem. However, it does say you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. So if you are able to open my video on your end, please do. Otherwise, I will start with just audio.
Does anybody know how that works? Okay, this goes.
Here we go. That works. Thank you. Thank you, AGBU and IFI for holding this event. Thank you, Lynn, for the invite, even though it coincides with the Brazil-Croatia game right now. I will try to be as brief as possible. I'm not an expert as the distinguished guest on archives. I'm just been asked to comment from my experience as an investigator for over a decade now, investigating and building briefs for prosecution at the ICC for genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity for about 9 years, and now at the UN for the last almost 4 years, about the use of archives in our investigations. So although eyewitness testimonies are still considered the best evidence as we bring witnesses and survivors to testify, that evidence is often criticized for being inconsistent with what happened because memory fades, because there are contradictions between witnesses, because it is subjective based on the person's emotional state, political motivation, and the recollection of the event depends how much time has passed. This is why archives are important. There are different type of evidence that doesn't fade over time unless it's poorly stored, as we have encountered some cases, and or unless it's manipulated and written by an author who has certain political agenda. So archives and the investigations I've done have played different roles. In some roles, it was corroborating evidence, supporting what our witnesses are saying, who are survivors of armed conflicts and mass executions. In other cases, it was more of a historical overview. So if you look at the what happened to the Yazidis or the Armenians or other groups, religious groups that had conflict between them, especially in the Middle East, you can't look at it if you want to explore the potential international law related crimes. You can't look at it as an isolated incident. You need to go back historically to find out how often has this happened between this perpetrator and this group of victims, and the reason it had happened in the past, if it's still ongoing or not. So that way you're not investigating it as an isolated incident that was sparked by a feud between two different tribes or groups or villages, and that there's more to it. There is an intent of extermination, let's say, but from one group towards the other. And this is where archives come in, because as I said, the stories passed down from one person to the next or from one generation to the next can be impacted by the person or by their memory or their views on the political situation in their country or in their community, whereas archives are, they stand alone as independent historical witness of what happened. And that when you look at these big crimes that like genocide and crimes against humanity that take place over a long period of time and they're widespread and systematic, you need to look at the history to understand the conflict before you go and you find where you need to investigate and who you need to talk to. And often in these international cases and prosecutions, we don't only bring in the survivors or the eyewitnesses to the event, or even many cases, the insiders, including perpetrators who have confessed when we interview them. One of the most important witnesses that we bring to introduce the case is what we call an overview witness. And these are often academics, historians, university professors who have relied on archives to study the history of the conflict, the political situation in the country, and to come and explain the conflict to the judges before the individual witnesses who have witnessed one limited event can come and give their evidence. You need these overview witnesses, and their knowledge come because they were not part of the conflict, often comes from the archives and the academic studies they've done about this conflict and its history. Collecting archives and using them for investigation is one thing. Using them as evidence is another thing. So when we use archives for such international investigations, we need, most importantly, to determine the source. So we know if there's a contamination here in the documenting of events and facts. We need to authenticate the actual document. I've had in our investigations documents that were doctored, that were tampered with, introduced as evidence. Of course, there are the tricks of the trade where you test the ink and you know if this is really from 10 years ago or from a year ago, and you know if the witnesses are bringing you a document that is a genuine archive or not. Also, the preservation. You need to account for the chain of custody, not only find out the source, but also who has had custody of these archives, who has handled these archives, and have they been tampered with. Increasingly now, we see in our investigation that we're moving away from the traditional type of paper documents and archives into digital archives. So social media like Facebook and YouTube, they have their own archives now that we request directly or through law enforcement agencies that we're working with in that country. Because unlike witness testimony, again, that is subjective, if a person's emotional, they will see things differently during a very violent event and they're in shock. Whereas this video footage that an activist or a witness is taking and placing on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter comments, all that is very objective because that is filming things as they happen. And today we are increasingly using these kind of archives from years back by requesting from these social media companies to use as evidence. Sometimes we come across them in open source investigations, and we know they're going to fall off down the road. So to preserve them, we have our forensic officers extract them forensically, preserve the URL of the site. If this video disappears 6 months later, we have it. So the technology is playing a big part in today's world, and how we use archives, we preserve them, we have showed chain of custody, so that they will pass the test in court and be used as evidence. I don't think I have much time left. I was gonna have some examples from cases.
One minute.
One minute. Yeah, I was gonna give some examples from cases where like a couple of years ago, I came across a case where, based on archive photos and an informant's testimony, someone was accused of being a member of a terrorist organization where we operate now, and was about to receive a life sentence. The judge exceptionally gave him the benefit of the doubt and ordered the forensic police here to examine this photo that shows him holding a weapon with the logo of the terrorist organization. And it turned out to be that it was among doctored archives and tampered with archives, where the informant had placed the person in the photo, and it wasn't really this person, which you couldn't see with your naked eye. So the training and the technology today, and the capacity building that we're trying to do with activists who archive events is very important. And the last example I'm going to give is, I'm in a place now where they have millions of pages of cases involving crimes against humanity, but it's all handwritten. And they involve hours and hard labor by labor's hours and hard work by judges and investigators that can go up, including perpetrators' confessions, that can go up in smoke. Was a lit cigarette that is neglected or left in the warehouse. What we've done now is we've given them the scanners to scan those millions of pages, so the archives are digitized, and that way, instead of spending hours looking for a name or a phone number, we're giving them also the training and for database searches. So instead of flipping through pages for hours, you just put a name or a phone number of perpetrator or a victim or an incident, and it goes through all these scans of millions of pages to advance your investigation and to be efficient when you're investigating war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. So technology is very important. That's it for me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paulo. So we go straight ahead to the last talk of this panel, and we are moving from the technological aspects. We talked a lot about of this, to the question of or the topic of archives and transitional justice. And we have as our panelist here, Lisa Ott, Dr. Lisa Ott, and she's the head of the Dealing with the Past program at Swiss Peace. So please, Lisa, appear.
Yes, hello. I have the similar issue like Paolo. It says that the host has to activate my video if you like to see me or my presentation.
Please.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for the invitation. You hear me, right?
Yeah. So
okay.
Whoever is using the computer, could you host Lisa? Perfect. Okay, we can see you.
Perfect.
And hear you.
The light is not ideal. I wasn't able to test it. Okay. Hello, everybody. Many thanks for the invitation to this conference. I am going to speak a little bit about the link between transitional justice, or dealing with the past, as we refer to at Swiss Peace, and archives. And I prepared a brief PowerPoint presentation that I will try to share.
Looks good.
Looks good. Now even better, right? So I'm going to talk about transitional justice. That's the title of my intervention. And in order to explain to you what it is that I refer to, you see here in the title of my presentations, actually, I wrote transitional justice / dealing with the past. So normally at Swiss Peace, we refer to a bit broader concept of dealing with the past rather than transitional justice, because we feel that it is more precise, and transitional justice is often understood as only referring to judicial processes. So from now on onwards, I will be referring to dealing with the past, but don't be confused, because many other actors and individuals, they refer to transitional justice, and essentially we usually refer to more or less the same. We just feel that dealing with the past is more on point to emphasize that these processes are not only limited to judicial ones. So what is dealing with the past? I copied here one of many possible definitions that I could have used to explain dealing with the past. And it states that dealing with the past refers to the processes for addressing the rights of victims and societies as a whole, as well as the obligations of states with regards to truth, justice, reparations, guarantees of non-recurrence in the aftermath of grave human rights violations, breaches of international humanitarian law, and related grave forms of corruption that facilitated these crimes. So dealing with the past is really about processes that are put in place to address situations of large-scale violence, large-scale human rights violations, and in the case of armed conflicts, also breaches of international humanitarian law. We mostly refer to situations where there is some kind of political transition, but especially presently, as many contexts, transition seems to be quite far away. We think that several of the considerations that refer to this process are already important to think about before the transition actually comes. So what is it that dealing with the past tries to achieve? And I'm referring, and I will come to that a bit later, specifically to, for example, truth commissions, tribunals, like, for example, also the ICC that Paolo was just speaking about. So different mechanisms that are put in place to deal with a heritage of large-scale violence. So some of the objectives of these measures are the prevention of impunity and the non-recurrence of past violations. So mechanisms are put in place in order to prevent similar incidences to happen in the future. Another objective is to provide reparation of the harm done to victims. So the idea is that victims who have suffered grave human rights violations should receive measures which would redeem the damage that they have suffered. It is also seen as a step towards reconciliation of a war-torn society. It is framed as a contribution to the establishment of rule of law. And ultimately, it is framed to contribute to the transformation of the conflict, and often also to a certain degree of the society as a whole, because many societies, we see that structural injustices sort of have contributed to these violations, including genocide, of course, that we are speaking a lot about at this conference. This is a graph that we work with at Swiss Peace. Swiss Peace is the Swiss Peace Foundation. We are an NGO. We have developed this graph together with the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs several years back. And it tries to explain what the different pillars are that should contribute to, that should be addressed in order to contribute to a dealing with the past process. And this is a graph, a pedagogical graph, which simplifies a lot of very complicated things. But I think it's also kind of useful to give you an overview of what the kind of processes are that we are talking about. So the circle that you see here is built upon 4 pillars. The first one you see on the top left, it's the right to know. So it's the idea that victims, but also society as a whole, should know what led to such human rights violations. And for this, sometimes truth commissions are established. You can see the examples below the title of the right to know. Investigation panels, documentation, of course, access to archives, etc. Another pillar is the pillar of the right to justice, which you see on the bottom left. Here, for example, civil lawsuits and alternative dispute mechanisms, but also international criminal tribunals can contribute to the right of victims and society as a whole that justice is achieved in view of violations and crimes that have happened. Also other courts, witness support and protection, etc. The third pillar is the one you find on the bottom right. It's the right to reparation. I already mentioned this, the idea that victims have a right to receive reparations for the damage that they have suffered. And here there's different forms, of course, rehabilitation, compensation, restitution, etc. I'm not going to go into detail at this point because I will come back to this graph with regards to the relation to archives. The fourth pillar is the one, maybe the most difficult one, which is the one related to guarantees of non-recurrence. It parts from the idea that governments in such a transition that want to contribute to undoing the harm that has been done during such situation of large-scale violence should put in place measures that prevent similar violations happening in the future. So here, for example, measures can be the disarmament, the demobilization and reintegration of former combatants, but also institutional reforms, democratic control of the security sector, and lustration or vetting, which is when, for example, security sector staff is the security sector is the staff is vetted in a way that it is one tries to make sure that persons who could be responsible for grave human rights violations are not promoted in their charges or ideally are removed from their public responsibilities. If you want to know more about this concept of dealing with the past or transitional justice, I've shared here a link. You can also Google it. It's a document that's called a holistic approach to dealing with the past. And it gives a very simple overview in the slide that I just gave it to you sort of on this concept and the thinking and the legal basis for this approach. Now, how is this related to archives? So, as you can see, archives, we don't refer to archives in terms of old paper documents that are somewhere stored in a basement and nobody's interested to it. It is I'm generally talking about information, and of course information is instrumental for all of these 4 pillars that I was just talking about. So on the upper left, for example, you can see a picture of the archives of the Moroccan Truth Commission. So, for example, with regards to the right to know, a truth commission was established, and subsequently the archives of this commission, when the mandate ended, are stored and ideally are made available to the public, which in practice, of course, is very complicated and happens in very few cases. But this is to show that archives are instrumental for any measure or activity that is undertaken in view of the right to know. Then with regards to the second pillar, the right to justice, Paolo was talking a little bit also about the kind of information that could be relevant for international tribunals. So with regards to the right to justice, here you have pictures or paper documents that could be useful as evidence in a process to investigate who is responsible for a crime, under what circumstances could it take place, etc. With regards to the third pillar, the right to reparation, on the upper right, you can see that archives or information can also be useful for memorization activities. This is, for example, a picture from a museum in Chile which was put in place in remembrance of the victims of the military coup. And this is also a kind of activity which can contribute to dealing with the past. It contributes to the fact that society knows what happened, what led to this, but it's not a judicial process. It's really about museum, where it's about to inform the public of what happened. And then with regards to the fourth pillar, by the way, all of these pillars are, of course, connected, and it's quite difficult to, in practice, they're not that separate from each other. They are interlinked. As I said, this is sort of a model to give you the basic idea behind transitional justice and dealing with the past. So the fourth pillar, bottom right, guarantee of non-recurrence. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt you, but 1 minute and then
Okay, perfect.
I'm sorry,
Yep.
but
No, it's good. It's because I don't see the watch when I'm sharing the screen. So vetting, on the bottom left, you see the archive of the former Stasi police, the secret police in the former Eastern Germany, which are today still available, so people can see whether the Stasi actually had a record on them. And also for public purposes, these documents are used and are really important to have an understanding of who was involved in such structures in the past. So what is the kind of information that is relevant for dealing with the past? Maud has referred to some of this. So the information in these archives is about violations of human rights and breaches of international humanitarian law. You can, for example, find information is relevant that gives information on who the perpetrators are, what was their modus operandi, how did they work. But it also contains information that shows how civil society organizations were organized, how they struggled for the protection of human rights can be interesting for dealing with the past. And also how institutions, for example, responded to such organizations. And then further down, of course, also historic documents that show how a certain conflict affected the way of life and the community on the different levels. So really a lot of information can be useful for dealing with the past processes. Just one brief example, the Colombian Truth Commission, which concluded its mandate in August of this year. It has put part of its archive available in the internet. And here, for example, there is a witness testimony that is available over the internet, and which was a basis for their final report. But there is many more examples on how also civil society organizations, besides these official mechanisms like truth commissions, can use archives in order to contribute to dealing with the past. Just one final 5 seconds. I think what's important on this topic of linking dealing with the past to archives is the fact that dealing with the past is a long-term process. This is something that takes a generation, 2 generations, and it's difficult to say beforehand what kind of purposes the archives can be used for. So they need to be stored also for purposes that maybe now are not clear. Chain of custody, property value was already referred to by Paolo. I think it's important to have in mind that we always talk about also very delicate information about survivors. So it's really important also to protect this information in the interests of the survivors. And then finally, the topic of access to these documents. So I just mentioned the Colombian Truth Commission, which made some of its archives available, but it remains to be seen whether all of their archive will be available and for what purposes in the future. With this, I conclude. Sorry if I extended. Thank you so much.
thank you. Okay, a lot to process, I guess. I hope you are still with us. So, Maud, please. So we have now a little bit time. How much? 5 minutes, okay. To ask questions, and I think we can start with the online questions because the people are silent somewhere on the globe. So are there any Q&As in the chat here? Can someone open the Q&A session, please?
Hi, Michel Oster, I'm photographer. I work with
then let's start here.
I work with the military scouting too, for the archive. One thing, when you're knowing the archive, we have two different parts. You have like Beato in the 1800, that he makes some military pictures. He redo the scenes to work on it. And we know that because he worked on it and he talked about it. And you know, now in digital archiving, we have the EXIF data in pictures. So in fact, we are sure that it's genuine picture. But in between, we have the negative. And sometimes you have the picture without the negative to be sure that it is a genuine one. How we can work with it. And can we talk about its real history without asking the people? This is a question mark that everybody, me also, when I do some archive, I work for the Tukan family in Palestine. So I got the negatives to scan, so I'm sure that the pictures are real and genuine. But if we don't have the negative, maybe you can work, because we know sometimes some photographers are working in the old negative and they do the replicage, they retouch the negative and give you another pictures. How an archiving will be sure for the history that is a genuine picture? Thank you.
Who wants to answer this? I think it's a question for Maud.
I'm afraid I cannot answer, because I think it's more a question for somebody specialized in photography. I cannot. Yes, sure. You archive yes, sure, but you usually the archivist who is not a specialist in all the media, he count on the provenance. Okay, he tried to be sure of the provenance of the document, but this kind of examination or test to know if the picture has been modified, or to know what happens between the negative, the first genuine negative, and the positive one, I think it is not. It is out. It's beyond the specialization of a normal archivist. I don't know, unless he is already specialized in this kind of archives.
I'm not allowed to talk because Paolo will answer, but Michelle, we can talk later as well. So Paolo, let's ask our investigator about the photo stuff. Paolo? Yeah.
Hi. I mean, I don't know among archivists, but it's important also to have, with the technology advancing so fast these days, to have technical experts. In our, whether at the ICC or with the UN special team, where now we're investigating war crimes, we have forensic officers who are experts. So when we seize a laptop, even if everything's been deleted, they have ways to try to retrieve what was seen in it. When there's a photo or a document, there's properties where they can access how many times has been altered or who's accessed it. I'm not an expert, but they are, and they can tell you. I was offered a video of men whose throats being slit and thrown into a hole in one of the conflicts in Africa where I was investigating, that it was related to our conflict from recent events. And then our forensic expert did the reverse search on the internet and managed to locate the very first time, although this video had showed up on the internet in different places, the very first time, the first person ever posted it on the internet. And it turned out to be, it was a different country and a different group. So there are technical experts for investigation units and with international units who can assess the origin and the authenticity of a document or a photo. But I think people involved in archives need that kind of capacity building, that kind of training.
Yeah, thank you, Paulo. Another question?
To Mrs. Maud Stefan, some archives can be very sensitive, very, very sensitive. So how many years should pass for archives to be opened, to be used by the public? When I think of the 1865 events in Lebanon, still certain documents haven't been revealed to the public. So how many years should pass for documents to be studied by the new generation. This is one. And then I have another comment. This is more of a comment. Well, concerning the Armenian genocide, well, a lot of Ottoman archives have been falsified. Well, the Turkish government says, come and use our archives. And a lot of archives have been falsified. So how can we?
Has been what?
Falsified. How can these documents be used? I mean, when a government says, come on, our archives are open, come and use, and yet we know that a number of those archives have been falsified. So this is a comment, but the first one is how many years should pass? Because some documents are very, very sensitive. And the example is the 1860 event in Lebanon. Thank you.
Yes.
Short answer.
I think it is related to the law of each country. Each country has its own law to decide which archive can be open to the public and which will be stay restricted. There are a lapse of time after which most of the archives will be open, but they keep some of them restricted for security reason. And this is depends on the theme or the subject, and it depends on the kind of archive. You cannot have a general answer for this.
Okay, I think there's so many interesting discussions and questions, and I get communication and signals that we have to stop here and move to the next panel. Sorry that I have been the bummer of this evening with this moderation, but we have another big panel and then we have a fireside chat as well. And I think afterwards we can talk anyway. So thank you very much for all the speakers, Lisa, Maud, Paolo, and for the questions. And now the moderator will be Lynn, and she will be online. So I give over to Lynn. Please appear.
Good evening, everyone. Just a quick sound check before we begin. Can everybody hear me? All right. Well, firstly, I would like to begin by thanking the Issam Institute, the AGBU Lebanon chapter, and the Lepsius Potsdam teams for your incredibly important work and for bringing us all together here for this important occasion. I am delighted to be amongst peers and colleagues, and I greet you from Abu Dhabi. I have today with me a panel of distinguished practitioners and academics, and I will be introducing each of them one by one as they speak. I would like to begin by setting the tone on why are we talking about regional and global experiences when it comes to memory and justice. One of the things that we will learn today is how similar many of these cases are. How the Yazidi case parallels with the case of Cambodia and parallels with the case of Tunisia, even though they come from different contexts, even though the calls for transitional justice and other forms of accountability and listening to the past, as our earlier speaker shared, might be different contextually. There is tremendous learning and there is tremendous collective global experience. And that is what we are here to really bring out on this occasion. As the co-founder and managing director of the Zovigian Partnership, we as a team and a family have been very committed to supporting efforts by the Yazidi people in Iraq, not only to preserve identity and intangible cultural assets, but to also play a leading role in documenting voices of survivors and taking them to the international criminal courts. And so today I am delighted to welcome our first speaker, Haider Ilyas, who dials in from Sinjar, Iraq, co-founder and president of Yazda organization, a dear friend and collaborator for the last 8 years. Haider is going to walk us through the challenges and the importance of building memory for justice for Yazidi genocide survivors. Haider, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I'm trying to enable my video, but here in a second, I think I should just start without a video until it's enabled. Can everybody hear me?
We can hear you very well. Welcome, Haider.
Thank you very much. The room is not too bright anyway, so we are experiencing a lot of electricity troubles here in Sinjar. But I want to thank you for inviting me to speak at this incredibly important event. And I want a special thank you for Lynn for suggesting me to speak at among Yazda colleagues. For those of you who are not familiar with what's happening today, Yazidis, unfortunately, because of a lot of problems happening today in the world. Here in 2014, ISIS committed a genocide against the Yazidi community and attempted to destroy the entire community back then. They killed more than 2,000 people in the first few days and abducted more than 6,400 men, women, and children, and 2,750 of which have not returned to their home yet. You know, and today, after 8 years living in internally displaced camps, slightly less than a quarter of the population have returned to their ancestral homelands, and approximately over 100,000 people have migrated to Europe and few other countries outside of Europe. And nearly 196,000 people have remained in these internally displaced camps, lacking the simplest service, the basic life supports, unfortunately, until even today. But we at Yazda are trying to do in terms of humanitarian and advocacy, such as primary health support for many villages in Sinjar, especially for those who have returned to the mountain and returned to Sinjar area. Also, another project of preservation of the culture heritage for the community. Mental health and psychosocial support projects, justice and accountability projects where we are partnering with a UN investigative team for bringing those perpetrators to justice. Also, our main part is advocacy services for education and returning the life of these families back to normal. Together with one of our closest partners, Zorian Partnerships, and other organizations, we advocate for the following goals for the community. One of them is restoring its security back to normal, where the community can trust the authority, or the community can trust to come back home. Together with ZP, we published a very important, very thorough report about the security and the main factors behind not being able to leave these camps and return home. Also, we're advocating for the local administration, such as appointing a mayor for the region to encourage the safe return, and also supporting the reparation process for people who could not afford to return because of almost all the houses have been looted or destroyed by ISIS or other neighboring Arab villages around the community. Also, we're advocating to put many measures in place to prevent future genocides. Unfortunately, all these things are happening to a small community like the Yazidis, and we as small organizations have been finding it very difficult and very hard to do any of the work without, anyway, I got the video. Thank you. And so what we are trying to do is, without the help of organizations or incredible organizations like Zovirian Partnerships, I think it would have been very, very difficult for us to begin working for this community with such limited capacity, with such difficulty working in the region for political and security reasons. So we're thankful to those who tirelessly, selflessly are jumping in and helping organizations like YASDA. One of our most important project is, like Lynn mentioned, is bringing perpetrators to justice. Together with the UN team, creating tribunal courts and cooperating with the German and French and other governments to collect more evidence on those perpetrators and make sure that we trial those ISIS members who've committed genocides against Yazidis and other minorities. So with that, I will stop for any Q&As. I would be happy to answer some of the questions. Unfortunately, I have too many topics. I'm not sure exactly. All of them are equally important here, as Lynn very well is familiar with this. Thank you very much today for being here. Thank you for inviting me. I feel like I'm here with you in spirit as I see you all watching me and other speakers passionately speaking about the issues happening in the world. Thank you once and again.
Thank you so very much, Haider. Clearly, the role of archiving and the impact of rigorous and credible archiving has multiple roles and channels and contributing roles. Beyond just justice in courts, it also enables advocacy. It gives voice to communities who are still suffering chronically from insecurity and political persecution. So thank you very much to Haider and the very hardworking YASDA team for your important efforts to drive forensic and scientific documentation with your United Nations counterparts to also alleviate the ongoing burdens facing the Yazidi people today. I know that we have one of our speakers who is still struggling with getting on Zoom, and so we will pause on welcoming Farah Hashid on the Tunisian case until her technical situation is sorted. In the meantime, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Makram Rabah, a lecturer of history at the American University of Beirut. In fact, Makram and I went to AUB together, and it is incredible to see how so many of our colleagues and peers over the years have really invested significantly in scholarly and rigorous methodology. And it is heartwarming to know that the American University of Beirut continues to be a critical safe space for the region and scholars around the world.
In the courts of Cambodia.
Makram, I want to pass the floor on to you to hear about how archiving is being used and how important its role is to play in the case of Lebanon, more than 30 years since the end of our civil war. Over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Lynn, and it's so nice to see you after all these years. Good evening, everyone. My name is Makram Rabah. I'm a lecturer of history, actually modern Lebanese history, and I work directly on the Lebanese Civil War. But here I'm not talking on my behalf, but rather on behalf of for documentation and research, and particularly on Monica Bergman, as well as Marie-Claude Said, which could not be with us, so I am for them. The whole debate on archives, the whole debate on archives, particularly, I heard a number of things which I don't agree with, but given that this conference isn't actually just about oral history. So I heard one of the people say that oral testimonies are not valid, whereas written ones are. This is absurd in my book, especially that I personally work on oral history. And particularly, one has to go back on the whole debate of archives in Lebanon and talking about the civil war. Because in 1990, the Lebanese state issued an amnesty law. This amnesty law gave a get out of jail card for the ruling establishment, which time and again have used this amnesty law in order to get away with murder. So particularly the work on archives in started during the Syrian occupation of Lebanon in a number of ways to try to talk about the right to know. However, I think many of us fell into this trap that we didn't really talk about ending impunity and justice, because it's not what we have in the archives. In the case of Lebanon, we don't have a lot of official archives, but we do have archives stored with families, with some institutions such as AGBU, and with which has worked. And this is something which Luqman actually, I think one of the reasons why Luqman Slim was assassinated was the fact that he refused to stay silent. And we're not only talking about the recent crimes, but rather the fact that these men and women, civilians as well as combatants who paid for their life, didn't really have the chance to speak. So Luqman and Monica through a number of projects, and I was lucky to be a member of many of these projects, particularly working on collecting oral history testimonies from people who fought and people who were in a way involved in the civil war. So particularly the whole debate, I think now, shouldn't be on the right to know. And I think our Swiss colleague had focused on this, but rather ending impunity through the archives. And this is something I continue reminding people that as a kid, I never assumed that in a million years we will see someone like Milosevic being put on trial. But we did see him go to court, and we did see him being held accountable for what he is. So I think rather than just dwelling on the archives and trying to find these documents, whatever they are, documents are there, but we need to train people to preserve them, digitalize them, and make them accessible. And this is what has been trying to do in a number of ways, because as you know, location in Lebanon is dangerous because many of the political establishment and parties in general have this tendency to destroy and burn archives because they want to hide their crimes. So our main job now is to send them abroad, to preserve them, but more importantly, to document the ongoing crimes, because what happened, the amnesty law that was passed in 1990, throughout the Syrian occupation of Lebanon, many of the crimes that were perpetrated under the premise that these were personal crimes, these were political crimes, they got away with them. And this continued after 2005, after the assassination of Rafiq al-Hariri, and many of the ongoing crimes that have a political motive can be archived and can be used properly in order to end impunity. So rather than just dwelling on archives and dealing with the past, I think our job as people dealing with historical memory is to also collect testimonies. And this is something which I've done over and over again, both with with the history department, as well as with NGOs such as Fighters for Peace, whose jobs are to convert people one person at a time by telling them their own experience. So in the case of Lebanon, trying to wait for the state, in the case of the Armenian genocide, for example, you have a whole community and a whole diaspora that pays a lot of money to ensure that people do not forget, as well as the Armenian state there has invested heavily in institutions. The Lebanese state has invested heavily in making people forget by forcing us to forget. So our job is to keep such institutions as UB and as the Armenian Genocide Archives, as well as I think one controversial issue which we haven't been able to deal with in the Arab world, and I would like to talk about this, is to try to understand how the Holocaust studies are. Not engaging in what the Zionist movement has done, but rather what people have done with the Holocaust. With studying the Holocaust and archiving the Holocaust and making it accessible to people, not to turn it into a political tool, but this is where my work on collective memory comes in, that different organizations and different communities in Lebanon have weaponized memory and have weaponized collective memory in order to turn the diversity that we have into a curse. So by deconstructing this narrative, and more important, by understanding what we have in our archives and how we can use it to both give people the right to remember, but also to use the right of remember to end injustice and impunity. And this is what I think is important here. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Makram, for these important words, recognizing that depending on context and depending on objectives for archiving and documenting, certain methodologies become relevant and certain methodologies don't. We will have the opportunity to investigate these diverse scientific and more public mass participatory approaches during our Q&A. I'd like to also welcome our next speaker, Gayane Keshunyan, who joins us to talk about Cambodia, a case that is not here in the backyard of our region, but one that has tremendous relevance and key learnings relevant for so many communities who have faced conflict and who are also seeking long-term justice and accountability. Gayane, it's wonderful to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I'm also not able to start my video. I think I need permission from you.
Gayane, your video should now work. Wonderful. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Hi, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here among such esteemed panelists. I'm very honored, so thank you. Just so you know that I'm an attorney. I'm currently in Los Angeles. I was at the court in Cambodia in 2015 in the judicial chamber. I'm currently working with witness testimonies as a consultant for the purpose of record keeping. So it's great to be here to talk about this. For those that are not so familiar, I would like to share some background to illustrate why the court in Cambodia came about and what it documented. So behind me, you see is the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia. That is where the court is housed in Phnom Penh. And so in Cambodia from 1975 through 1979, the Khmer Rouge regime led by Pol Pot attempted to engineer a communist society, and in doing so caused the death of nearly 2 million people through forced disappearances, forced marches, starvation, torture, detention centers, and mass executions. And the regime in particular targeted city residents, intellectuals, the ethnic Vietnamese, Cham Muslim population, and the religious leaders. So despite the fall of the Khmer Rouge regime, the government of Cambodia continued fighting the Khmer Rouge in different capacities. Some leaders were granted amnesty or positions in the government in return for their defections from the Khmer Rouge party. And so many years after the atrocities happened, Cambodia asked the United Nations for assistance in bringing justice to those who were responsible for those crimes committed under the Khmer Rouge regime, and specifically against those who had not defected from the Khmer Rouge party. So in 2003, an agreement was signed which established the court and was to prosecute those most responsible. So not everyone, those most responsible. So the court became operational in 2007, and this year the legal proceedings ended almost 2 decades later. And now the ECCC, as it's called, is focused on working with the survivors and public education. As a result of this tribunal, 8 people were charged, 3 people were convicted, $300 million were spent, 334 witnesses testified, and importantly, the court created an objective, reliable historical record in doing so. And I want to talk about some of the unique aspects of the court that lends to some of those successes in light of this panel of memory, truth, and justice, which I think are so important. What the court did was integrate Cambodian people at every stage in the process. So the court is sort of a hybrid tribunal, as it's called. We have the international, it's an international court in conjunction, in cooperation with the Cambodian government. So every international position at the court had a Cambodian national as its counterpart. So for the prosecutor had a co-prosecutor, which was Cambodian. So you had a international co-prosecutor and a national Cambodian prosecutor. You had Cambodian judges, you had Cambodian co-defense counsel, Cambodian judicial legal officers. And so also the court had victims serving as civil parties in the proceedings, and they had their own lawyer. And they were sort of a third party role, and they were entitled through this proceeding to seek collective and moral reparations from the convicted persons in a way that was different from the prosecution's role. And aside from that, over the years, hundreds of thousands of Cambodians attended the trials and got to see the charged perpetrators questioned and or the witnesses questioned and testimony tried. The witness testimonies in this case came from 334 witnesses, experts, and as I like to call them, survivors, which were then validated by these successful convictions. And I think in a way, what that does is it provides a safeguard against historical revisionism. People will always, I mean, there is always room for people to argue, but what this court did was sort of add a safeguard. Because here we have an international court in cooperation with the country in which the events took place, using internationally recognized standards of testing evidence. It charged and convicted individuals, and it really gave history a picture of what happened in detail, where it happened, which city, which province, and who it happened to, which minorities. So it's very detailed. And then, of course, Cambodia has this great documentation center. It's called the Documentation Center of Cambodia, which is the largest repository of Khmer Rouge records in the world. And it keeps these testimonies. So I will say, you know, in reflecting on all of this, and I think about these issues a lot, you know, the successes and you know, these undertakings. Any large international undertaking that spans decades and costs hundreds of millions of dollars is naturally going to draw criticism and cynicism. Sure, and that is okay. It's good to reflect and improve. But if we're trying to measure success in light of the topic of this panel in mind, you know, memory, truth, and justice, well, we have truth in an objective and vetted historical record. We also have justice through the court convictions obtained where prison time was served in proceedings which met all the international relevant standards. So if we measure success from this lens where Cambodian people were participants at every stage and level as lawyers, as defense counsel, as judges, as witnesses, as viewers, it seems that the tribunal was successful in how it utilized and even created record and documentation. So I want to thank you for having me. I won't take up too much time. Open the floor for questions.
Thank you so much, Gayane. And thank you so much for bringing to perspective the importance of credibility and the challenges and limitations of the design of justice mechanisms and the creation of spaces for memory and for justice. Realities that, frankly, are probably felt by many of our scholars, colleagues, activists, peers, and friends gathered here in the room and on Zoom tonight. I have two discussion questions to kick off a dialogue between our three esteemed panelists today. I'd like to begin with my first question, which is, what is the feedback of survivors that you have each worked with towards documentation and archiving experiences? In this safe space that brings together so many minds and hearts, can you share with us moments where documentation has actually felt unauthentic, unprofessional, and even unethical? We have Haider, whom I would like to invite to also open back his video so that we have both Haider and Gayane on the screen. And Makram, could I invite you to kick us off, since you are on the grounds of Beirut, whilst the rest of us are virtually present?
Yes, thank you very much, Lynn. Talking about the validity of written archives, it's actually something which I have worked extensively when I wrote my latest book on the conflict in Mount Lebanon between the Druze and the Maronites, basically what we call Harb al-Jabal. So many of these available archives which people have taken as authentic are basically archives that have been cooked in the sense that people don't know the background, and anyone who could use it could find actually a document that says something and it's completely fake. And one example is a story that was told to me by former Minister Ghazi al-Aridi, who used to run something called Radio of the Mountain. During the Lebanese Civil War, the PSP used to play a joke on Amin Ismail. They used to call him the Shah of Babda in reference to the Iranian Shah. And they used also to call him Samosa, which is a Nicaraguan dictator. This is something that they knew personally that he hated, the reference to these dictators. So one day, a letter shows up to the actual by mail to the Radio of the Mountains from the Somoza family, requesting that the Radio of the Mountain refrains from using the word Somoza because Somoza is a much better leader than Amin Ismail, and it goes on to insult Amin Ismail. So this is actually something which Ghazi al-Aridi wrote himself and asked his secretary to mail out. And they, when it arrived, and they told him, listen, we found this, and said, oh, it's genuine, so go ahead and add it. So anyone who goes into the archive and finds this will assume that this is a genuine document sent from the Nicaraguan family. So in a way, if we do not go ahead and investigate these archives and what's the background behind them, anyone who will show up in a decade or so who is far removed from the actual events will not know how to deal with it, and thus will contribute in a way in making things worse. So ultimately, going back to what I said on the panel, one has to have the required expertise as well as a network of people he can consult in order to make sure that these archives do not transform into a tool for violence and for further bloodshed in a way. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks. Clearly, archiving can be used as a tool for politicization, further violence, and tokenization of survivors. Haider, could you tell us, in your experience, whilst the Yazidi people continue to experience genocide on the ground in Sinjar, could you, in this safe space, talk to us about examples where documentation have not served in the interests of survivors who continue to participate in documentation efforts even until today?
Yes, thank you, Lynn, for the question. I think it's very important to find and to have motivated survivors. A lot of survivors at the beginning of the genocide, when they were tracing their way back to their community, when they were escaping or being freed or rescued, they were so traumatized and they were so in a shock that it was difficult for many of them to come forward. And later on, they would find out about the organization called Yazda, and they would come to us. And actually, their courage and their bravery and tenacity have taught us a lot in terms of documenting. We have been fortunate to get their cooperation and the beat of the heart in many, many cases, and which is very, very difficult to deal with the traumatized survivors, where you can count everything that can go wrong with us, with the process of documentation, with the methodology, and especially you cannot trust every organization as a survivor to do this work for you. But we have been fortunate to get a lot of testimonies, a lot of stories that are incredibly important for whether for the preservation of the memory of the Yazidi culture and the community, or collecting evidence against the perpetrators. Those members have come to us in many cases and have trusted us to do a good work with these testimonies. And we did not expect this would happen, and we get this amount of trust from the community, especially for the survivors. Something that we never expected, but they have come forward, and they still are coming forward with a lot of frustration, with a lot of, a slow process and not cooperation from the Iraqi side, where the tribunal courts or the Iraqi government not being this part or a member of the states, the Statute of Rome, or not being able to cooperate with the international community. All this frustration comes and process on the brain of the survivors, but they still come to us and hope for alternative ways, such as tribunal courts in Germany or in France or in Netherlands or in other places. And doing justice is always part of their goals, is their main priority, I should say. And whenever there is a case in the international community, of course, it highly encourages every survivors. Our phone rings all the time by the messages of relief and courage and positivity. So we're really fortunate to have a number of survivors coming forward and speaking their stories.
Thank you so much, Haider, for those important remarks. Guyane, in Cambodia, what can you tell us about survivors feeling disappointed or discouraged by documentation and archiving practices?
I can't really speak to the to that because I haven't worked directly. I was in the judicial chambers. But I know that you mentioned something about where documentation felt unauthentic or unprofessional. And I will say
yes, please.
that if you read the, and I encourage you to read the hundreds of pages of the judgments of the trial, please, you can see where the chamber, when you have a witness who maybe took part in the atrocities at a lower level, maybe they were not the mastermind, but they took orders. You can see sometimes they try to minimize their participation and try to distance themselves and say, I tried to help people, I didn't really do this. But you see the court then judge rules on their credibility and deems it inauthentic because they have so much other evidence, so many other testimonies saying that no, this person was actually in charge of this place and they gave direct orders and they didn't help people. And so you see where the court sort of is able to judge whose testimony is authentic and not. So I think that's very important, and we get to see how that process works because we get to hear their statement and we get to see the court evaluate and judge what actually happened and who's speaking the truth.
Thank you so much. That level of governance and accountability remains very delicate. And as our first speaker said, archiving already begins with a form of violence, which is selection. The violence of selecting and silencing intentionally and unintentionally critical voices and stakeholders that are all part of that experience and collective journey. I realize that we are out of time with our second panel on a topic that deserves not 1 hour, but at least a few days. Thank you very much to my peers who joined us this evening, and I would like to pass the floor back to Beirut, back to Roy, and closing with a very interesting fireside chat. يعطيكم ألف عافية.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you kindly.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we now move to the fireside chat, the last panel. And a fireside chat means it's a very fast-paced forth and back and so on. And for this, we have Irina. Irina, can you hear us? Yeah. And where is? Ah, you're here. Ah, okay. Because just looked okay. So please, Ayman, I think you will conduct this chat. Be gentle, but thorough, and then.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really delighted to be joining you again. It's my second participation in one of the 6 conferences organized by IFI and AGBU. And it is the very difficult position of having to close the event. This is why I'm really lucky to be joined by Irene Victoria Massimino from Argentina. So all the way there. Not necessarily right now to ask her questions about her experience and what happened in other countries, but try to, close the discussion, trying to look at archives for the future. So a forward-looking approach to these to archiving, to documentation, by asking Irene a few questions about how to move forward with archiving in a situation where we are currently being archived, given that we're living in a society where we're now producing and consuming data second by second, by using our phone, by knowing who exactly is sitting next to us, by sharing our location, by sharing so many things about our lives. There are people archiving this, companies, governments, individuals, openly or not. From a scientific and forensic perspective, what does it tell us about the future of archiving, and how will the different stakeholders use these new methods of documentation? Irene, do you have any answer to this? Irene, you're muted. Sorry, so we couldn't hear what you said. So if you can unmute, or I don't know if there is a technical problem. No, we can't hear you. Sorry. Is she still on mute? Sorry. Can you try, please, without the AirPods? Yeah. And try to use the sound system of the computer directly.
Hello, Ayman. This is Lynn, speaking for Irene, who is sending some chats on the Zoom for us, confirming she is unmuted and is unmuted using her PC. So we invite the AUB technical team to give support to our speaker. And it's great to see Ayman again, who's also a former colleague from a long time ago.
Can you hear me?
Here we are. Irene is now with us.
Oh,
Lynn,
sorry. Okay. Sorry, I apologize. I was saying apologies. It's probably the speaker, the head speaker. So I'm using the computer now. Thank you. I'm sorry I missed part of the panels because I was flying literally from the US to Argentina, and I landed an hour ago. So I came straight to the conference. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. I've been in some of the preparatory meetings, so I know what it was about. And I'm a lawyer, so I'll have to start answering a little bit as a lawyer, Issam, unfortunately, but also as I'm the co-president and co-founder of the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention. And we put a lot of emphasis in genocide prevention from the empowerment, from the perspective of empowering the grassroots. And there are a couple of elements that we have in the current world that are quite different from what the archive used to be long ago. As you may know, Argentina has an unfortunate experience of several dictatorships in the 20th century, being the last one, the sixth dictatorship, the bloodiest one with the most amount of crimes. Argentina, however, through many years went to an interesting, unsuccessful, and later on successful justice process, but a quite interesting also unsuccessful truth commission, where a lot of information was gathered, a lot of evidence was gathered, not in a judicial way, but in the form of a specific truth commission. And this created later on in the future an archive of evidence, an archive of testimonies, an archive of some legal evidence, etc., that was later on used in the internal national justice processes. However, we have, as I always say today, a different tool, which is this. Everybody, as you mentioned, everybody has a phone. And one interesting example, in just 2 minutes, so we continue with this very interesting dialogue here about archive and how can we use technology to put forward, to empower people as well, is in one of the latest protests in Chile. I think it was I don't want to say the wrong, but I think it was 2021. An app was created in order for people to immediately, through the phone, make a claim of the violations committed in that particular case by the state, by the military and the security forces. So this idea, we looked at this idea with the Lemkin Institute, and we actually started with some colleagues in Iraq. I think there was a Yazidi here, colleague from Yazda. We started to think of different genocidal parties in this particular case, because we work with genocide and genocide prevention and accountability, etc., of different patterns that people could describe very simply through an app in the phone, and start gathering evidence that would later be used. I mean, because the purpose of archiving and the purpose of all the evidence we gather is, at the end, in my view, and this is the personal opinion from experience, is to eventually have justice processes that obviously for the difficult scenarios sometimes cannot be carried out immediately, sometimes takes decades, sometimes more than a decade, of course, 40, 30 years, etc. So I think one of the, yes.
Can I challenge you or ask you a question to clarify the importance of using technology by giving you examples from Syria and from the big tech companies? So it's been a fight for so many human rights organizations with Google and YouTube to maintain evidence of war crimes perpetrated in Syria. The only way they were archived for a while and put on the cloud were for activists to post these videos online on YouTube. Yet they contradict the community services of YouTube. So says Google, they were removed. Facebook has also extremely strict community guidelines, and Twitter, regardless of what will happen with the platform, now imposes very strict restrictions on how far you can go in the past without having to buy, with a lot of money, packages in order to have access to what was posted online. So at the same time, we have tools that can help us a lot, but at the same time, where the big amount of knowledge exists is today not that accessible, definitely not for academics and scholars. I mean, I really know the budgets of, unless you're one of the top big American universities, you cannot necessarily afford to have access to all of them. So how can you deal with such a situation?
Well, I'm not an expert in archiving, I would say, but you're right, Issam. I agree 100% with you. And actually, many of these tools that you mentioned, Facebook, etc., could be and were accused of complicit in maybe, I mean, we put the case of the Rohingya, and there's so much hate speech. So on the one hand, they put limitations toward how far you can go in the past to archive information, and yet they allowed several forms of hate speech that can cause outrage and create and fuel genocidal scenarios in different countries. I mean, we saw it with the radio system in Rwanda. So the forms change, but the patterns tend to be similar. And we saw it with the Rohingya on Facebook, which was openly violent. In my view, and I'm not an expert, there is an extraordinary organization which is Bellingcat. Bellingcat is a non-governmental organization which records and works in the particular case of Armenia, for example. I'm sure you're all familiar with the execution of 7 Armenian soldiers in the 13th of September illegal attack of Azerbaijan in the Republic of Armenia, actually in the territory of the Sovereign Republic of Armenia. That was geolocalized and photographed, all confirmed by Bellingcat. So unfortunately, and you mentioned something very interestingly, the money doesn't go where it should be. It should go to organizations like Bellingcat or similar organizations that are trying to create apps, which is, in our particular case, this is what we were trying to do in Iraq. It's just very difficult to find the funding for that. So people could have their own tool and they wouldn't be dependent on Facebook or Twitter or these platforms that are not managed at all. On the contrary, the information there is of public domain afterwards, but of public domain of who controls the company, but apps and other means that could be used with people, for people, and to eventually archive this relevant information and to make immediate claims of what is going on. And in our particular case was to use and is to use technology in order to determine whether certain patterns could conduct to genocide in order to prevent the further escalation of violence. So I don't have an answer. I mean, I wish I had an answer for this. I think it's a struggle that we face. On the one hand, we had incredible technology that we could use. And on the other hand, we, like the common people who don't have the money to create this wonderful platforms, have limited access to them. But I think there are ways around. I put this example of Chile, and I think it's a great example. I wish I could circulate it around. I will look for it and try to circulate with all of you because it was wonderful. Yes.
No worries about not having a very precise answer, or actually you did, because usually the best thing about these discussions is that it leaves our audience with more questions to ponder and new areas of interest. And in the same kind of field, today we are living a crisis of trust, a crisis of confidence. Polling all over the world is showing that citizens definitely do not trust political parties anymore, do not trust the systems of government, do not trust the media. And part of it has been, in a way, a campaign initiated against many of these institutions through information manipulation, dis and misinformation campaigns. Do you feel that people who work in the field of academic or forensic documentation, who are not necessarily directly involved in political disputes, do they still enjoy a modicum of trust, of confidence from the society that would allow them to continue their work in a serene way? Or they're also today in a situation where they have to fight to actually just state the evidence that actually Earth is not flat? Is the risk reaching today those working in documentation and archiving to prevent genocide and the most horrendous crimes?
Thank you, Issam. This is a very difficult question. So you're putting me on the spot here, but it's very interesting. I mean,
that's what happens when you land directly 1 hour after your flight lands. Yeah.
Yes. No, I think when I think about how the world has evolved, and I think of, I can answer only from experience, right? And one tool that we have in this specific world is, I always say, civil society. And I guess I come from working a lot with civil society, and I am part, I founded my own civil society, and I work in empowering the grassroots to recognize patterns of genocide and also for accountability, etc. So I think a great source it's civil society. Of course, then your question jumps in again when civil society is somehow interfered by politics with capital P, right? Because what we do now is politics, actually. Everything we do is politics. But politics with capital P, or party politics, if we want to call it in English. So I think that's when it becomes a problem. I think we live in a world where we have too much information. It's very difficult. I always say to my students, I'm a lawyer actually, but I teach some courses, and I always say, well, whatever answer you want, you will find it on the internet. So if you want to say that this is gray, you will find it on the internet that this is gray. So I think this is where it comes about knowing, at least having some fundamental knowledge of the different crimes we're dealing with. And that is why the discussion, for example, in the particular case of genocide that we work with, it's so important. And it's so important to know that is a political crime, and then how we determine that evidence to know if this is not a political crime. And I think the key actors in this are civil society organizations. And I think one of the questions to the previous panel was about evidence in Iraq. And I remember when I first went to Iraq was in 2016, January, right after the liberation of Sinjar. And I was amazed at the organization of survivors. There was this Christian organization, Shlomo, who were part of those who invited us. And they were gathering so much in local information of what was happening. And I think that's something that we have now, because we have these tools, the phone and the computer, and we have so much technology that can help us to do quickly, to record videos, to take photographs, etc. So I think that's why this key actor of civil society, I think is very important when we have this, as you say, a very divided, also very, somehow I feel that some political parties have become a religion for people. So I believe in this individual. So when we fall into that difficult limit, then I think a good source could be civil society and the empowerment of grassroots, general knowledge of the crimes we're dealing with in order to gather the proper evidence, identify the proper crimes, etc., to be used in the future. So that would be, again, a mixed answer to you, Issam, unfortunately.
Thank you. And my last question, since we're short on time, is about another actor, the field of arts and culture, because this is also a very important sector when it comes to preserving memory, to actually sometimes circumventing censorship on official political narratives through songs, through music, through theater, through dance. But at the same time, there is nothing further from purely academic archiving than arts and culture, because it's all about selecting. It's all about telling one story. It's all about, you know, having to select some tiny moments of someone's life to turn it into something important, musical or a painting, etc. So are those working to preserve memory through arts and culture doing a job that would complement the archivists' documentation, or they're actually playing a role that doesn't help archiving and documentation because of their selectivity, which sometimes can go towards reconciliation and in other times go towards purely identity politics?
I think, I mean, this is such an interesting topic, and we could talk for hours. It's beautiful. I particularly love art. I think art plays an incredible role, specifically in education. Implementing, for example, genocide education and international crimes in general, talking about different atrocities at different ages, I think is very difficult. And there are ways, and art plays such a relevant role in that, because through a movie, through music, etc., as you said, one can see the identity of the place. So it's sort of like art also plays the role of reliving. I remember the case of Cambodia, for example, with Cambodia Living Arts. Here, the experts in Cambodia will probably agree with me that it was a rebirth of the traditional Cambodian music that was forbidden during Pol Pot's time. So it was a way to, it's a way of memory, it's a way to complement the archives, but also it was the rebirth of the origin of that Cambodian identity that was tried to be repressed. And I think in many ways, and probably in a lot of ways, art plays a fundamental role. I remember once again in the return of democracy in Argentina in 1984, one of the first things to be done was to bring out, it was an enormous concert, and was to bring all the artists that were forbidden to sing publicly and that went in exile during the dictatorship in Argentina. So it's also a way to, I don't know how to say it in English, but to retake the place that was at one point taken by the perpetrators. So there is no better way, I think, and this is a very personal opinion, to retake that place immediately than by art, music, movies, paintings, etc., photography, etc. And I think it works. And I've spoken with several survivors as well, and from a survivor's perspective, many of them paint, many of them write, and it's a way also to create a personal memory. It's a way of releasing what happened in the past, all of the sufferings, and it's a way to let others know what occurred to them in a way that is also artistic, it's cultural, it fulfills, it touches the soul in so many specific ways. And personally, for me, in my particular case, sometimes certain cultural interpretations allow me to see a broader and more profound picture of the atrocities, but also the consequences of those atrocities in a society. So I do not see any negativity in using the art. On the contrary, I see it as an exceptional tool for education, for identity reconstruction, for reaching people that are not, because all of us here know about genocide, know about crimes, but a lot of people know. A lot of people do not know. A lot of people have not even the knowledge. Some have not even heard the word, right? So in that way, one reaches the masses in a very, maybe could be say, spiritual form.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you again, Irene. Thank the audience, the organizers, and most importantly, to encourage you and encourage us all together to continue on this fight against impunity, whether through documentation, through legal actions, through politics, through art, culture, civil society work. We're all pushing towards accountability, ending a culture of impunity that has destroyed millions of lives in the last century and even longer than that. And if we want to live in a century of peace, I think it all starts with ending impunity. And this is thanks to all the efforts everyone here and our colleagues have been making. Thank you very much. Yes, and I think we're all invited for a coffee and some nice pastries in the room over there, the overflow room.